118. Treason as the crime against humanity. One of the central legal events of the 20th century was the war crimes trials of Nazi leaders after World War II. The trials are an embarrassment to many scholars who tend to skip over them hastily, or, as with the Larousse Encyclopedia of Modern History from 1500 to the present day, 1964, to omit all mention of the Nuremberg trials. The origin of the trials was at the Tehran Conference. At that time, Stalin, called Uncle Joe by Elliot Roosevelt, proposed the mass execution by firing squads of at least 50,000 Germans at the end of the war. Churchill at once protested against this as injustice. President F.D. Roosevelt suggested, as though the matter were a joke, a compromise of 49,500 executions. The final decision was to execute some leaders of Nazi Germany by means of a formal trial. Others, far more than the 50,000 stipulated by Stalin, were summarily executed, while the British and Americans looked the other way. Thus, Churchill's request for legal procedure was met, and the Stalinist demand for vengeance satisfied. What Stalin had done earlier to the Poles in the Kachin Forest massacre was again repeated, but this time a portion of it was given the facade of legality. An agency was created by the victors called the International Military Tribunal, and a schedule attached called the Charter. This agreement was made by Russia, the United States, Great Britain, and the so-called Free French government. Article 6 of the Charter created two new crimes against international law: crimes against peace, defined as planning, preparing, or waging a war of aggression or a crime in violation of international treaties. The second crime, crimes against humanity, was defined as inhumane acts against any civilian population before or during the war, and persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds. Under these terms, the leaders of Britain and the United States could have been tried and executed for the brutal bombing of Dresden. Dresden had been registered with the Red Cross as a hospital city. More destruction and death were wrought there than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Russians were fully aware of the fact that the trials were a farce. To embarrass their quote-unquote allies, who knew full well that the Russians were guilty of the mass murder of Polish officers, about 15,000 of them, in the Kachin Forest, the Russians charged the Germans with the Kachin Forest massacre. These charges made obvious to the Germans on trial, and thoughtful Germans everywhere, what a monstrous hoax the claims of the court were. Much time was spent on the Kachin Forest massacres at Nuremberg, but the embarrassed Allies eliminated all mention of it in the final verdicts. While the murder of 50 Allied officers in Germany was investigated and judgment rendered, the death of 4,443 to 4,800 Allied officers and men, and the disappearance of 10,000 more in the Soviet Union was ignored, as were other Soviet offences, not to mention British and American ones. The Nuremberg war crimes trials were a brutal, barbarian travesty on justice. They demonstrated how far indeed humanism had gone in its march into barbarism. Legally, they were without justification. Beck had more justification for his anti-Hitler activities. Hitler had broken his oath to uphold the German constitution. On the other hand, the Nuremberg war crimes trials did meet a very major religious function, and it anticipated a new kind of morality and thinking, one which would soon begin to penetrate regular legal circles: the crime against humanity. At the heart of David's awareness of his sin is his cry, "Against thee only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight." Psalm 51 verse 4. David was a war criminal. He had used the occasion of a war to kill off Uriah in order to cover his adultery with Uriah's wife Bathsheba, who was pregnant with David's child. David, however, does not speak of his crime against humanity, society, or man. Rather, he declares that he has sinned only against God, because, however much men were affected, the law was God's law, the people were God's creation and servants, and David himself, another servant and creature of the Most High God, the only sovereign and lawgiver. Crime is against the sovereign and the sovereign's law. Hence, to this day in England, whatever the offence, a criminal is charged with offences against Her Majesty the Queen, because it is believed that the monarch is sovereign, and the law is royal law. In terms of Christian legal tradition, crime is against God and against God's law, God's peace, and God's justice. Hence, at one time all courts began by invoking the Trinity, the source of all law, and university classes began with the same invocation, since all instruction comes from the word of the triune God. This kind of order is possible when theology is the queen of the sciences, and theology is not speculative, but biblical theology. Humanism, the religion of humanity, has a new definition of crime because it has a new sovereign, man, collective man, humanity. Crime is thus against humanity and against, not the peace of God, but the peace of man. Since World War II, this view of crime has been increasingly in evidence. In France, Pierre Laval, trying to save France from absorption into German hands, worked shrewdly as Prime Minister of Vichy France. He was able, although incurring the bitter hatred of Hitler, to save half of France's Jewish population and several 100,000 Frenchmen from deportation. For all of this, he was executed. His crime was his nationalism. The French resistance killed more Frenchmen than did the Nazis, but they were international socialists rather than national socialists, and their murders were thus seen as justice. Many other lesser men than Laval, such as Quisling, were similarly tried. After 1917, the world began to view affairs from an internationalistic rather than a nationalistic perspective under the influence of the Russian Revolution. Earlier, humanism had racial and national overtones. Now it had become internationalistic, and crime was defined as against humanity. But the result was also confusion and moral chaos. Raymond Aron, a French scholar, commenting on the Frenchmen who joined a Hitler Legion during the war, raised the question: if they were not traitors, who is a traitor? If they were traitors, why are the Frenchmen who collaborated with the Americans and the British not traitors? Why are the communists, who may someday collaborate with the Russian army, not traitors? On the day on which each party has chosen its ideology, there is no longer a national entity, and with the same stroke of the clock, there are no more traitors. There are just clusters of foreign parties accusing each other of treachery. Indeed, in such a situation, either all are traitors or none are. The issue came up again after World War II in the 1950s and early 1960s in various trials of scientists guilty of passing on important secret data to the Soviet Union. On two counts, there was massive resistance and public pressure from intellectuals, students, and radicals to these trials. Alger Hiss is still viewed as a martyr by many, and Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were executed, still are subjects of books reflecting the humanistic addiction to hagiography. We still live in a world of saints' legends. Only the saints have changed to humanistic ones, and the legends have become even more unbelievable. First, the offences of these various spies and traitors were regarded as no offence at all because they were working for an international socialist movement which, for all its faults, was ostensibly dedicated to the cause of humanity. Hence, these traitors and spies became heroes and saints to millions. Most of these traitors believe this of themselves. Second, some were scientists who saw themselves, both politically and scientifically, as members of an international community, and hence dedicated to the cause of humanity, rather than the country of their citizenship. They were thus above the law of the state because they represented the order of humanity. The student movements of the 1960s also, among other things, took up the cause of humanity and viewed all things it disliked as crimes against humanity. Racism, inequality, colonialism, and much else, all aspects of the older humanism, were now condemned by the newer internationalistic humanism as crimes against humanity. The idea of crimes against humanity is a very dangerous one, however. First, a crime against humanity can mean almost anything a mob, an elite, or a majority can choose to make it mean. It is thus destructive of law rather than supportive. Second, the concept enthrones as sovereign and lawgiver a non-existent entity, a collective noun. Humanity includes Christians and non-Christians who cannot be agreed. It includes very alien racial and national traditions. In practice, therefore, the sovereign is not humanity, but the greatest immediate power and the nearest gun. Third, since humanity includes all men, who then is the criminal? Of course, it's not humanity as such which is meant. Various international agencies have refused, to date, to see any crimes against humanity, for example, in Idi Amin and Uganda's brutal massacres of Christians and dissidents, but they do see crimes against humanity in Rhodesia's and South Africa's white regimes. The key, of course, is that Uganda has a socialist black regime, whereas South Africa has a white regime, which is widely held to be conservative, although it is economically also socialist. Humanity thus means the idea of humanity and world order as espoused by the newer humanism. Older humanism and Christianity are alike under condemnation in terms of this concept. Thus, treason has a new definition in terms of the new religion. Treason is now increasingly viewed as a crime against humanity. More and more, not merely treason, but other crimes are being defined in relation, not to the God of Scripture, but humanity.